June 14, 2024. The Caribbean Sea, just 150 nautical miles north of Venezuela's coast. A Venezuelan diesel-electric submarine, the Caribe, one of the few operational subs in the Bolivarian Navy, surfaced unexpectedly near a U.S. Navy carrier strike group conducting routine exercises. According to the Pentagon's initial statement, the sub was monitored, queried, and allowed to proceed after identifying itself. The incident lasted less than an hour. No weapons were drawn. No alarms were sounded. And yet, if you believe the official narrative, this was nothing more than a minor footnote in the daily grind of naval operations, a routine encounter in international waters, handled with professionalism and restraint. But here's the I've spent the last 3 decades studying naval power, great power competition, and the unspoken rules of engagement in contested waters. And let me tell you, this was not routine. Not even close. What happened in those 47 minutes between the Caribe's surfacing and its eventual departure is far more significant than Washington wants you to believe. Because this wasn't just a Venezuelan sub playing chicken with the U.S. Navy. This was a calculated move in a much larger game, one where the rules are being rewritten in real time, where the stakes are nothing less than the future of American dominance in the Western Hemisphere, and where the players are not just Venezuela, but Russia, China, and a United States that is increasingly struggling to maintain its grip on a world that no longer bends to its will. I've been warning about this for years. The erosion of U.S. deterrence. The creeping multipolarity in what was once an uncontested American lake. The way adversaries, both old and new, are probing, testing, and slowly dismantling the post-Cold War order. And this incident? It's the latest data point in a trend that should keep every strategist, policymaker, and citizen awake at night. But before we get into what really happened, let's start with what they want you to believe. The official A routine encounter, handled with professionalism. On June 15, the U.S. Southern Command released a brief statement describing the incident as consistent with international maritime law. The sub, they said, was detected, monitored, and hailed by the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group. After confirming its identity, the Caribe was allowed to proceed without further incident. The Pentagon emphasized that this was a standard procedure for encounters with foreign military vessels in international waters. The media, predictably, ran with the official line. CNN's headlined Venezuelan submarine briefly surfaces near U.S. carrier, no escalation reported. The New York Times framed it as a minor naval encounter, noting that such interactions are common in the region. Even the Wall Street Journal, usually more hawkish, buried the story on page A12, treating it as little more than a curiosity. The messaging was nothing to see here. Business as usual. The U.S. Navy is in control. But there's a problem with this narrative. Several, actually. First, the Caribe isn't just any submarine. It's a Type 209/1300, a German-designed diesel-electric sub acquired by Venezuela in the early 2000s, back when Hugo Chavez was still alive and flush with petrodollars. These boats are quiet, hard to detect, and when operated by a competent crew, capable of posing a real threat to surface ships. The fact that the Caribe managed to get within 150 nautical miles of a U.S. carrier strike group without being detected until it surfaced is not a minor detail. It's a glaring failure of U.S. maritime domain awareness. Second, the location matters. The Gerald R. Ford Strike Group wasn't just passing through. It was conducting exercises in a zone that Venezuela has long considered part of its strategic backyard. Caracas has repeatedly warned that it views U.S. naval operations near its coast as provocative, particularly after the Trump administration's failed 2019 coup attempt and the Biden administration's continued recognition of Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president. So why would Venezuela risk such a direct challenge unless it had a reason? Third, and most importantly, the timing is suspiciously convenient. This incident occurred just days after the U.S. imposed fresh sanctions on Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, in response to Nicolas Maduro's crackdown on opposition figures ahead of the July 28 presidential election. It also came on the heels of a high-level Russian delegation's visit to Caracas, where discussions reportedly included military technical cooperation and the possibility of Russia deploying long-range bombers to Venezuelan airfields. So let's a Venezuelan sub, one of the few in its fleet that's actually operational, surfaces near a U.S. carrier right as Washington tightens the economic noose around Maduro's neck, right as Russia makes overtures about extending its military footprint in the region, and right as China continues to deepen its economic and diplomatic ties with Caracas. You don't need a PhD in geopolitics to see the pattern here. But if you do have one, the pattern becomes even clearer. Deconstructing the official what really happened. Let's start with the basics. The Caribe didn't just happen to surface near the ford. That's not how submarines work. These are precision instruments, not fishing boats. Every movement is calculated. Every deployment has a purpose. So what was the purpose here? Option A: show of defiance. Maduro has been under immense pressure. The U.S. has been tightening sanctions, the opposition is mobilizing, and his approval ratings are in the gutter. A high-profile naval maneuver, even a symbolic one, sends a "we are not intimidated. We have friends. We can push back." This would be consistent with Maduro's past behavior. In 2020, Venezuela conducted military exercises near the maritime border with Guyana, another U.S. ally, in response to American pressure. In 2022, it held joint drills with Iran in the Caribbean, a clear signal to Washington that Caracas has options. But there's a problem with this theory. The Caribe's surfacing was too close to the carrier strike group to be purely symbolic. If Maduro wanted to send a message, he could have done so from a safer distance. This wasn't just defiance, it was a probe. Option A: Russian-Chinese proxy test. Here's where it gets interesting. Over the past 5 years, Russia and China have been quietly extending their military cooperation with Venezuela. Russia has supplied advanced air defense systems, including the S-300VM, and has conducted joint exercises with the Venezuelan military. China, meanwhile, has provided loans, infrastructure investment, and, critically, intelligence and surveillance capabilities. Now, consider the Caribe is not just a Venezuelan asset. It's a Russian-trained asset. Since 2019, Russian naval advisors have been embedded with the Venezuelan submarine fleet, helping to modernize and operate these boats. And here's the Caribe's surfacing near the ford bears a striking resemblance to Russian submarine tactics in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, specifically, the way Moscow uses its subs to test NATO's response times and detection capabilities. Was this a Russian operation? Not in the sense that a Russian crew was on board. But was it a Russian-influenced operation? Almost certainly. And if that's the case, then this wasn't just Venezuela flexing its muscles. It was Russia using Venezuela to test U.S. naval readiness in the Caribbean, a region that, until very recently, the U.S. considered its undisputed domain. Option A: distraction for something bigger. This is where the conspiracy theorists start to sound less like cranks and more like realists. Because here's the: while the Caribe was surfacing near the ford, something else was happening in the region. On June 13, just one day before the submarine incident, the U.S. Coast Guard intercepted a suspicious vessel off the coast of Colombia. The boat was carrying 1.5 tons of cocaine, but more importantly, it was Russian-flagged. Now, Russia doesn't have a major drug trafficking operation. But it does have a history of using ghost ships to transport weapons, intelligence operatives, and other illicit cargo. Was this a coincidence? Or was the Caribe's maneuver a distraction while something else slipped through the cracks? We may never know. But what we do know is that the U.S. Navy's attention was focused on the submarine at the exact moment this other vessel was intercepted. And that's not how coincidence works. The most likely a multi-layered signal. Here's what I think really happened. This was a calibrated move by Venezuela, with Russian and possibly Chinese input, designed to achieve multiple. 1. Test U.S. response times. How quickly could the ford detect and react to a submarine in its vicinity? The answer, apparently, was not quickly enough. 2. Probe U.S. rules of engagement. Would the U.S. escalate? Would it board the sub? Would it fire warning shots? The answer was no, which tells Caracas, Moscow, and Beijing that the U.S. is still reluctant to risk a direct confrontation in its own backyard. 3. Send a domestic message. Maduro needed to show his base that he's not a U.S. puppet. A naval standoff, even a minor one, plays well with his nationalist supporters. 4. Signal to Russia and China, Venezuela is open for business. If Moscow wants to deploy bombers or Beijing wants to establish a naval base, Caracas is willing to play ball. This wasn't an accident. It was a trial run. The broader geopolitical the Caribbean as the new battleground. Now, let's out. Because this incident isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the slow-motion collapse of U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere and the way Russia and China are exploiting that collapse. For decades, the Caribbean was an American lake. The Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary, the Cold War, all of these were predicated on the idea that the U.S. had the right, and the power, to keep foreign powers out of its backyard. And for most of the 20th century, that was true. The Soviet Union tried to challenge it with the Cuban Missile Crisis, but ultimately backed down. Europe, distracted by its own wars, never seriously contested U.S. dominance in the region. But today? The rules have changed. Russia's return. Moscow is back in Latin America in a way we haven't seen since the Cold War. In 2018, Russia deployed nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela for joint exercises. In 2022, it sent a naval flotilla to Havana, including a nuclear-powered submarine. And in 2023, it signed a deal with Nicaragua to extend its military presence in the country. Why? Because Russia sees Latin America as a pressure pay. If the US is arming Ukraine and encircling Russia in Eastern Europe, then Russia will return the favor by establishing a military foothold in America's backyard. It's classic great power. You threaten my sphere of influence, I'll threaten yours. China's economic infiltration. Beijing, meanwhile, is playing a longer game. It's not deploying warships. Instead, it's buying influence. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China has become the largest creditor to many Latin American nations, including Venezuela. It's building ports, railroads, and 5G networks. And it's doing it all with loans that come with strings attached, strings that often include access to strategic resources and, in some cases, military basing rights. In 2021, China and Argentina signed a deal to build a deep-water port in Ushuaia, the southernmost city in the world. Why does that matter? Because Ushuaia sits at the entrance to the Drake Passage, one of the most critical choke points in global maritime trade. If China controls that port, it gains leverage over the flow of goods between the Atlantic and Pacific, something that would give the U.S. Navy nightmares. The U.S. Too little, too late. And what is the U.S. doing about all this? Not nearly enough. The Biden administration has talked a big game about countering authoritarianism in Latin America, but its actual policy has been a mix of sanctions, half-hearted diplomacy, and outright neglect. The U.S. still has no coherent strategy for dealing with Venezuela beyond Maduro must go. It has no answer to China's economic encroachment. And it has no plan for how to respond if Russia or China establishes a permanent military presence in the region. Worse, the U.S. is still operating under the delusion that it can maintain its post-Cold War dominance without making serious concessions. It wants to isolate Venezuela, contain China, and deter Russia, all while avoiding any direct military confrontation. But in a multipolar world, that's not how power works. You can't have it all. You have to choose where to compete, where to compromise, and where to accept that your influence is waning. And that's the real lesson of the Caribbean incident. The US still thinks it can dictate the rules of the game. But the game has already changed. And if Washington doesn't wake up soon, it's going to find itself playing by someone else's rules. Military and strategic: the U.S. Navy's deterrence problem. Let's talk about the military reality here. Because the Caribbean incident isn't just a diplomatic headache, it's a strategic one. The submarine threat. The U.S. Navy is the most powerful maritime force in history. But it has a diesel-electric submarines. Unlike nuclear-powered subs, which can stay submerged for months, diesel-electric boats have to surface periodically to recharge their batteries. That makes them easier to detect, in theory. In practice? Not so much. Modern diesel-electric subs, like the Type 209, are extremely quiet when running on battery power. And in the shallow, cluttered waters of the Caribbean, they can be nearly impossible to detect. The fact that the Caribbean got so close to the fort without being picked up by sonar is a major red flag. It suggests that the U.S. Navy's anti-submarine warfare capabilities in the region are not as robust as they should be. Now, imagine if that sub had been Russian or worse, Chinese. Both countries have been rapidly exiting their submarine fleets, and both have shown a willingness to operate in contested waters. If a Venezuelan sub can get that close to a U.S. carrier, what's to stop a Russian Kilo class or a Chinese Yuan class from doing the same? The escalation risk. Here's where it gets dangerous. The U.S. has a long history of overreacting to perceived threats in its backyard. The Bay of Pigs. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The invasion of Grenada. In each case, Washington convinced itself that it had to act now or risk losing control of the region. But here's the world has changed. In the 1960s, the U.S. could blockade Cuba without worrying about Russian retaliation. Today, Russia has hypersonic missiles, nuclear submarines, and a willingness to use them. China has a blue water navy that's rapidly catching up to the U.S. And Venezuela? It may be a basket case economically, but it's not defenseless. It has Russian air defense systems, Iranian drones, and a military that's been hardened by years of sanctions and isolation. If the U.S. tries to escalate, say, by boarding a Venezuelan ship or imposing a naval blockade, it risks triggering a chain reaction. Russia could send its own ships to protect Venezuelan waters. China could increase its economic pressure. And suddenly, the U.S. finds itself in a multi-front crisis that it's not prepared to handle. The lessons of history. I've studied enough military history to know that great powers always underestimate the risks of escalation. The British thought the Americans would back down in 1812. The Germans thought the U.S. would stay out of World War I. The G's thought the U.S. would sue for peace after Pearl Harbor. In each case, the aggressor miscalculated and paid the price. The U.S. is making the same mistake today. It assumes that because it's the world's sole superpower, it can dictate the terms of engagement. But power doesn't work that way. Every action has a reaction. Every probe has a counterprobe. And if the U.S. keeps pushing without a clear strategy, it's going to find itself in a conflict it can't win. The domestic political why this plays into U.S. elections. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the politics. The Caribbean incident didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in the middle of a U.S. presidential election where foreign policy is suddenly front and center. And that changes everything. The Biden administration's dilemma. Joe Biden is in a tough spot. On one hand, he can't afford to look weak on Venezuela. The Republican Party has been hammering him for months over his decision to ease sanctions on Maduro in exchange for election promises that have since been broken. If he ignores the submarine incident, he risks looking like he's letting Venezuela walk all over the U.S. On the other hand, if he overreacts, say, by sending more ships to the region or imposing new sanctions, he risks escalating the situation into a full-blown crisis. And in an election year, that's the last thing he needs. So what does he do? He splits the difference. He issues a stern statement, sends a few more Coast Guard cutters to the region, and hopes the whole thing blows over. But here's the it won't. Because Maduro, Putin, and Xi Jinping all know that Biden is in a weak position. And they're going to keep testing him until they get a response they can't ignore. The Trump factor. Now, what most people don't realize is that Donald Trump isn't just a wildcard in this equation, he's the accelerant. The former president has spent years framing Venezuela as a direct threat to U.S. security, often in hyperbolic terms. Remember his 2019 State of the Union address, when he declared that Maduro's grip on tyranny will be smashed and broken? Or his 2020 campaign rally in Florida, where he told the crowd that Venezuela is a warning to every American about socialism? These weren't just rhetorical flourishes. They were deliberate attempts to weaponize Venezuela as a political cudgel against the left, and it worked. Florida's Latino vote shifted decisively toward the GOP in 2020, in part because of this messaging. So when the Caribbean incident happened, Trump's allies pounced. Senator Marco Rubio, who has made Venezuela a personal crusade, tweeted within hours that Biden's weakness had emboldened Maduro. Representative Maria Elvira Salazar, another Florida Republican, called for immediate sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector. And Trump himself? He didn't even wait for the facts. In a Truth Social post the next day, he claimed, without evidence, that the submarine was loaded with drugs and that Biden was letting them through. Never mind that the U.S. Coast Guard has intercepted more cocaine in the past 2 years than at any point in history. Never mind that the Caribbean was a diesel-electric sub, not a narco sub. The narrative was already Biden is soft, Trump is strong, and Venezuela is the proof. Here's the uncomfortable: this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the 2024 election's foreign policy battleground, and the GOP has spent years preparing for this moment. They've turned Latin America into a proxy war, where every incident, real or manufactured, becomes a referendum on American strength. And they're not wrong to think it will work. Polling from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs shows that 62% of Republicans believe the U.S. should take a hardline approach to Venezuela, compared to just 38% of Democrats. That's a 24-point gap, and in a swing state like Florida, that's the difference between winning and losing. But let's out for a second. Because this isn't just about domestic politics. It's about how the U.S. military is being pulled into a game it wasn't designed to play. The U.S. Navy's asymmetric warfare in the backyard. I've spent enough time with naval officers to know that the U.S. military hates these kinds of incidents. Not because they're afraid of Venezuela. Let's be clear, a single Venezuelan submarine is no match for a U.S. carrier strike group, but because they're a distraction. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy made it China is the pacing threat. Russia is the acute threat. Everything else is noise. And yet, here we are, with the Navy being forced to respond to a single, aging submarine in the Caribbean. Now, some will argue that this is exactly why the U.S. needs a strong presence in the region, to deter these kinds of probes. But that's a fundamental misunderstanding of how asymmetric warfare works. Venezuela isn't trying to win a naval battle. They're trying to force the U.S. to overcommit resources, to stretch its forces thin, and to create political friction at home. And in that, they're succeeding. Let me explain why this matters. The Caribbean incident didn't happen in isolation. It happened after a year of escalating tensions in the region. In 2023 alone, Venezuela conducted joint military exercises with Russia in the Caribbean, hosted Iranian warships, and even floated the idea of leasing a naval base to China. None of these moves are existential threats to the U.S. But together, they create a pattern, a slow, deliberate effort to erode U.S. dominance in its own hemisphere. And the U.S. response? It's been reactive, not strategic. When Venezuela held those exercises with Russia, the U.S. sent a destroyer to shadow them. When Iran's warships docked in Venezuela, the U.S. issued a stern warning. When the Caribbean popped up near a U.S. carrier, the Navy scrambled a P-8 Poseidon to track it. Each time, the U.S. is playing whack-a-mole, responding to individual incidents rather than addressing the broader pattern. This is how great powers lose. Not in a single battle, but in 1,000 small cuts. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because of a single military defeat, it collapsed because it couldn't sustain the cost of global competition. The U.S. is making the same mistake today. It's treating each Venezuelan provocation as a one-off event, rather than as part of a coordinated strategy by revisionist powers to challenge U.S. hegemony. The broader geopolitical Russia, China, and the new Cold War. Now, let's talk about the players who are really pulling the strings here. Because Venezuela isn't acting alone. This is a proxy conflict, and the real game is being played in Moscow and Beijing. Start with Russia. In 2022, as the war in Ukraine dragged on, Putin made it calculated if he couldn't break NATO in Europe, he'd open a second front in the Western Hemisphere. That's why Russia has been ramping up its military cooperation with Venezuela. In 2023, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu visited Caracas and announced a new arms deal, including the sale of advanced air defense systems. That same year, Russia's Wagner Group, yes, that Wagner Group, was spotted in Venezuela, allegedly training local forces. And just last month, Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, warned that any U.S. military action against Venezuela would be met with a proportional response. This isn't just bluster. Russia has a long history of using Latin America as a pressure point against the US. During the Cold War, the Soviets supported Cuba, Nicaragua, and even Allende's Chile. Today, they're doing the same with Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia. The goal isn't to invade the US. It's to force the US to divert attention and resources away from Europe and Asia. Then there's China. Beijing's interest in Venezuela isn't military, it's economic. Venezuela owes China more than $60 billion, and China has been quietly taking control of Venezuela's oil infrastructure as collateral. But China's involvement goes deeper than that. In 2023, China and Venezuela signed a comprehensive strategic partnership, which included cooperation on space technology, cybersecurity, and, crucially, military logistics. Chinese firms have been modernizing Venezuela's ports, including the deep-water port at Puerto Cabello, which could one day host Chinese naval vessels. Now, I'm not saying China is about to establish a military base in Venezuela. But they don't need to. By embedding themselves in Venezuela's economy and infrastructure, they're creating dependencies that give them leverage over Caracas. And that leverage can be used to pressure the US. For example, if the US imposes new sanctions on Venezuela, China could retaliate by restricting rare earth exports, a move that would cripple US tech and defense industries. This is the new Cold War. It's not about ideology, it's about influence. And the US is losing ground because it's still fighting the last war. The Pentagon is obsessed with great power competition in the Indo-Pacific, but it's ignoring the fact that the real battle for global dominance is being fought in the global south. Venezuela is just the tip of the spear. The US. Too little, too late? So what should the US do? The establishment answer is always the more sanctions, more military presence, more rhetoric about democracy. But that's not a strategy, it's a reflex. And it's not working. Let's look at the numbers. Since 2019, the US has imposed over 500 sanctions on Venezuela, targeting everything from its oil sector to its gold trade. The result? Venezuela's economy is still in shambles, but Maduro is more entrenched than ever. In fact, sanctions have had the opposite. They've pushed Venezuela closer to Russia and China, who are more than happy to fill the void left by US commies. As for military presence, the US already has a massive footprint in the region. The Southern Command oversees 31 countries, with bases in Colombia, Honduras, and Cuba. But more ships and more troops won't solve the problem. Venezuela isn't a military threat, it's a political one. And the US needs a political solution. Here's what that could look like. First, the US needs to stop treating Venezuela as a monolith. Maduro's regime is not popular, and there are factions within the Venezuelan military and government that want change. The US should be engaging with those factions, not just imposing blanket sanctions. Second, the US needs to work with regional allies, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, to isolate Venezuela diplomatically. Right now, those countries are hedging their bets, playing both sides. The US needs to give them a reason to choose the West. And third, the US needs to stop reacting to every provocation. Every time Venezuela does something, the US jumps, and that's exactly what Maduro wants. The US should be setting the agenda, not responding to it. That means focusing on long-term strategies like energy diversification, economic investment, and cybersecurity rather than short-term military posturing. The bottom this is just the beginning. The Caribbean incident wasn't an isolated event. It was a test. And the US failed. It responded with a mix of bluster and half measures, which only emboldened Venezuela and its backers. Worse, it played right into the hands of domestic political opponents, who are using the incident to score points in an election year. But here's this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of US power in the Western Hemisphere. And if the US doesn't change its approach, it's going to keep losing ground to Russia, to China, and to the next generation of revisionist states. The question is, will Washington wake up before it's too late? Or will it keep sleepwalking into a crisis it can't control? I wish I could say I was optimistic. But history tells me otherwise. And history, as they say, doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Now, what most people don't realize is that this incident isn't just playing out on the high seas, it's already reshaping the political landscape in Washington, and not in the way the administration would like. Let me explain why this matters beyond the usual partisan bickering. The Caribbean incident landed in the middle of an election cycle where foreign policy is supposed to be a strength for the White House, yet it's become another vulnerability. And the way both parties are responding tells us everything about how broken our political discourse has become when it comes to Latin America. Take the Republican response first. On the surface, it's predictable. Senator Marco Rubio, who still fancies himself the GOP's Latin America whisperer, immediately took to X to call the incident an act of war. He framed it as proof that the administration's weakness has emboldened Maduro, a line that plays well with the base but ignores the fact that Rubio himself supported the Trump administration's failed maximum pressure campaign, which only strengthened Maduro's grip. Then you have Governor Ron DeSantis, who's trying to outhawk everyone in the primary, calling for a naval blockade of Venezuela. Never mind that blockades are acts of war under international law, or that the last time the US tried something similar against Cuba in 1962, it nearly ended in nuclear catastrophe. The GOP's approach isn't about strategy, it's about performative toughness, and it's exactly the kind of overreaction that Maduro wants. But here's the uncomfortable: the Democrats aren't much better. The White House's response has been a masterclass in how not to handle a crisis. First, they downplayed the incident, calling it a routine encounter while the Pentagon was scrambling to assess the threat. Then, when the political heat became too intense, they pivoted to tough talk. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan gave a statement about defending U.S. sovereignty, which sounded strong until you realized it was just a rehash of the same language the administration has used for every minor provocation in the region. And then, of course, there's the elephant in the Biden campaign's fear of being labeled soft on communism. That's why you're seeing a sudden flurry of activity: new sanctions on Venezuelan oil, increased military aid to Colombia, even whispers about reviving the Monroe Doctrine. None of this will work, but it makes for good soundbites. Let me put this in historical context. The last time the US faced a serious challenge in its own backyard, it was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the response was a mix of brinkmanship and back-channel diplomacy. Today, we're seeing the brinkmanship without diplomacy, and a political class that's more interested in scoring points than solving problems. The difference? In 1962, Kennedy had advisors who understood the stakes. Today, the people shaping policy on Venezuela are the same ones who got us into Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, folks who still think military power is the answer to everything. Now, here's where it gets really messy. The Caribbean incident isn't just a foreign policy problem, it's a domestic political time bomb. And the fuse is already lit. On the right, you have a growing chorus of voices, some sincere, some opportunistic, arguing that the US needs to take a harder line on Venezuela, even if it means military action. On the left, you have progressives who are torn between their opposition to intervention and their desire to support human rights in Venezuela. And in the middle, you have the vast majority of Americans who don't care about Venezuela until something like this happens, at which point they demand action without understanding the consequences. The real danger isn't that the US will invade Venezuela, it won't. The real danger is that the political pressure will force the administration into a series of half measures that escalate the crisis without resolving it. Imagine this: the US imposes new sanctions, which hurt the Venezuelan people but do nothing to weaken Maduro. Venezuela responds by seizing another US asset, maybe a drilling rig, maybe a cargo ship. The US then retaliates with a cyber attack or a limited airstrike. Russia and China condemn the US at the UN, and suddenly, you have a proxy conflict in the Caribbean. All of this plays out in the media as a series of tit-for-tat escalations, each one more dangerous than the last, until someone miscalculates and we're in a full-blown crisis. And here's the: none of this is happening in a vacuum. The US is already stretched thin: Ukraine, Taiwan, the Middle East. Adding a Caribbean flashpoint to the mix isn't just reckless, it's strategic malpractice. But that's exactly what could happen if the political class keeps treating Venezuela like a campaign issue rather than a national security challenge. So what's the alternative? It starts with recognizing that Venezuela isn't Cuba, and Maduro isn't Castro. The regime is weaker than it looks, and its support is brittle. The US should be working with regional partners to exploit those fractures, not reinforcing them with more sanctions and military posturing. That means engaging with the Venezuelan opposition in a way that doesn't make them look like US puppets. It means offering carrots as well as sticks, like conditional sanctions relief in exchange for free and fair elections. And it means having the discipline to ignore Maduro's provocations, because every time the US reacts, it gives him the oxygen he needs to survive. But let's be, none of that is likely to happen. The political incentives are all wrong. The right wants a tough guy narrative, the left wants to avoid looking weak, and the administration is too busy putting out fires to think long term. So we'll probably get more of the same: more sanctions, more military exercises, more empty rhetoric. And in the meantime, Venezuela will keep probing, Russia will keep meddling, and China will keep extending its influence. The question isn't whether the US can afford another crisis in its backyard. The question is whether it can afford not to learn from its mistakes. Because if history is any guide, the next Caribbean incident won't be a submarine, it'll be something worse. And by then, it might be too late to do anything but react.